Welcome back to 2K Away. I'm Payton. This is my sister Paige, and we talk about murder and the macabre. We are a sisters true crime podcast. So this week, as I've been saying for the past 2 weeks now, I'm doing Peter Sutcliffe.
Finally.
Yes.
But first, I want to tell everybody, seriously, thank you so much for listening to us. It's like shot up and I am so happy about it. It's so
Oh
cool.
yeah. It's amazing. And over the next couple weeks, and I know I've been saying this for the past couple weeks, but our Patreon is made. It is just not live yet. We are making decisions on what different tiers that we're gonna have and
the
all
cool
that
things
good
we'll get
stuff. Yeah, exactly. And we're discussing merch,
you.
which would be super cool.
Really exciting.
We're in the process. There's stuff going on behind the scenes, but we just haven't, made it live yet. So again, today we're doing Peter Sutcliffe, aka as he is more better known as the Yorkshire Ripper. So let's just hop right into it. What?
Just FYI, probably gonna be 2-parter, maybe even 3. We'll let you know.
I was gonna leave that as a secret for the end and be like, and that is where I leave you for part 1. Of course, I'm gonna put Peter Sutcliffe part 1, but I wanted you to be. I almost didn't tell you. I was gonna wait for you to be like, no. Okay, so Peter Sutcliffe. I was trying to literally think of some sort of inanimate object that I could compare him to, because I was gonna be like, Peter Sutcliffe, the human toilet, but toilets are useful and Peter Sutcliffe isn't. So we're just
That's
gonna,
right, yeah.
yeah. So we're just gonna keep going, because I was like, trash bag, no. Trash can, no. Toilet, no. So
Mm-mm.
anyway, so Peter Sutcliffe attacked a total of 23 women, 13 of which were killed. So he, what's weird about him is that he was like really blatant about his attacks, and he would do it in like public places. The reason why so many women weren't killed is because he was interrupted by neighbors, passerbys, just so many
Like,
people.
how bold do you have to be to just go up and just attack somebody in the middle of the day or
Or
in
even at night.
crowded place or somewhere where there's witnesses? Like,
Yeah, it's just I know, like, the balls on this guy, like the audacity of this man.
seriously.
um I'm also, I think I might be playing an interview from him, just like a little snippet of him, because he sounds like a fucking moron, and I'm gonna rip on him pretty bad. Yeah,
You know, a lot of them
I'm gonna rip on the Ripper pretty bad.
do.
And again,
Look at you. Look
I
at
wanted
you.
to cover him because he did just recently pass away, and there's some issues about his death. You know what? I'll get to it.
Oh.
I'll get to it.
Oh.
So
Saucy.
this investigation was highly criticized and got, quite frankly, well-deserved hate.
Hmm.
So this investigation was like mid to late 70s and early 80s.
Hmm.
So at this time, and I'm going to go into it a little bit, but this investigation was in no regards am I trying to slander anybody that was involved in this investigation. It's well known to have been a botched investigation. Yes, they eventually caught
Hmm.
him, but many people could have been saved.
Hmm.
But we'll get to it. It was blatantly sexist. You know, it's mid to late 70s, a lot of changes are happening. They used a lot of not great terms, and they even did some in, because I have been watching the Ripper docu-series and I'm in the process of that, and even like they showed clips from the investigation, and I'm going to quote one of them. I'm going to quote a few things and a few people that were interviewed, because I think it's good to note. But I'm going to try and talk about the families and the women a little bit more, not to shed a spotlight on them, because I'm sure that's not what they want in their life, but just to kind of, I want to put them in a better light than what they were at the time, because they weren't, and they did not get the proper justice that they should have. Again, yes, he was eventually caught, but it took way too long.
Right.
So let's talk about Peter Sutcliffe's childhood. So he was born Peter William Sutcliffe on June 2nd, 1946, in Bingley in the West Riding of Yorkshire, Yorkshire, England. And I'm sorry to anybody in England and the UK and everything if I mispronounce anything. I apologize. I'm trying.
Well, and I've seen like memes about how like the Americans, it's Yorkshire. No.
I know, and that's the way I used to
Stop
pronounce it, and now I'm doing it correctly. I'm trying my best. It's just when I see it and I go to read it out loud for the first time, and then I fuck it up, and then I'm like, oh shit, no, Yorkshire, you know. So he was born to parents John William Sutcliffe and Kathleen Frances Sutcliffe. They were a working class Catholic family, you know, just your run of the mill normal family. He was kind of a loner, and apparently through adolescence, he never really showed any signs of strange behavior, unfortunately. But according to one of his brothers, because he did have several siblings, I'm not sure how many he had, but I know he had several siblings. And one of them said that their father was actually kind of an abusive alcoholic. He was verbally abusive to the kids, and I think he would, you know, physically abuse them on occasion. And there was a statement from his brother that said one time when the brother was about 4 or 5 years old, I'm not sure how old Peter was, but their father smashed a beer bottle over his head, over Peter's head.
Oh shit.
For sitting in his chair at the Christmas table.
Oh no.
So not great.
No.
He would whip them with a belt. And again, I don't know a lot about his early life. There's just not a ton out there about it. But what I do know is that apparently he had kind of a macabre sense of humor, which I can't really say anything about that.
I was gonna say,
Exactly. Yeah. So if that's an indication for violent behavior, then wow.
we are fucked.
We are. So anyway.
Oh shit.
Yeah. So I was like, oh, really? If that's considered bad, then put me away now.
Then I don't want to be good.
Right. If it's wrong, then I don't want to be right. But anyway, sorry. So apparently in his later teenage years, he started having a growing obsession with voyeurism. So voyeurism, for those of y'all that don't know, it's it is a voyeurism is the sexual interest in or practice of watching other people doing intimate things. So whether it's straight up sexual activities, getting undressed, things that would be done in private.
Oh, okay.
So apparently he liked it. So,
okay.
Yeah, by some reports, Peter hired sex workers as a young man, and there was kind of like a story that apparently he had like a bad experience with a sex worker and her pimp where she, I guess, like stole money from him or something of that nature. And but I honestly don't exactly know how true that is. If somebody knows, let me know. So he did develop an obsession with them. He would watch them on the streets of Leeds and Bradford. And I'll get into it later, but were you tired?
Yeah.
So I'll get into it later. But he claimed that God was telling him to kill sex workers.
Yeah. God doesn't tell you those things.
No, and if he does, then you shouldn't be listening to him.
No.
Also, if you hear a dog, that's my roommate's dog, Max.
Little baby.
I know. Him saying that God told him to kill sex workers, I've always thought was bullshit.
Oh yeah.
Because I think that the story of him being conned out of money by a sex worker, that kind of thing to someone who's already, this guy, I think was just a huge blow to his ego, and he just was searching for some sort of vengeance out of any possible woman who looked like a sex worker from then on. I think it just that sparked it, and that sparked his violent behavior because of the insecure little twat that he was. So he left school at age 15 and had kind of a series of kind of low paying jobs, including 2 stints as a grave digger in the 60s, which probably added to the macabre sense of humor, but I think that's cool as hell. So sorry.
There's
shows where I am, I guess. So between November 1971 and April of 1973, he worked at a place called Bard Television, a factory on a packaging line. And he ended up leaving this position when he was asked to be a salesman, on the road salesman, because apparently he didn't want to be on the road. But later, he became a lorry driver or semi-driver, for anyone that doesn't know what a lorry is. Yes. So before that, he worked night shifts at this place called Britannia Works of Anderton International. I don't know. But they basically had they had a bunch of their employees resign, and they gave them kind of like a severance package-ish. He got 400 pounds from this, which I think is a very small severance package, but whatever.
Yeah.
And he used a portion of that money to train as a heavy goods vehicle driver, which again is a semi or a lorry, depending on where you are. So the first job that he had as a lorry driver, he was fired because apparently he was stealing tires.
Oh.
And
not what I would have expected you to say that he was stealing.
Right, exactly. You'd think maybe goods from the trailer. Nope. Tires. I don't know if that's what he was moving. I don't know. So he was unemployed until October of 1976, when he found a job as a lorry driver for T&WH Clark Holdings Ltd. on the Canal Road Industrial Estate in Bradford. And I'm really sorry, I don't know where any of these places are. I know
you didn't do the map on this one.
Well, the thing is, as far as where the murders take place, I know in connection where they are, because there's a lot there's Yorkshire, there's Bradford, there's Manchester. We're going to be talking about all these places. But as far as the smaller places, like a specific location, no clue. And I'm really sorry. But I don't live there. Maybe I would have a better understanding, but unfortunately I don't. So Peter met Sonia Sersma, excuse me. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her last name, on February 14th of 1967, and they ended up getting married on August 10th, 1974. So Sonia had several miscarriages and was told that she wouldn't be able to have children, which is sad. So she was in the process of becoming a teacher, and there, I guess, Peter said there was. So, and he talks about it in this interview that I found, where she, during her training course to become a teacher, apparently she had an affair with an ice cream truck driver, which I found interesting. But this is also coming from Peter Sutcliffe, and he's a twat. So
take it with a grain of salt.
Right. So when Sonia completed the course in 1977 and began teaching, they used her salary, which I found rude, to buy a house at 6 Garden Lane in Heaton, where they moved into on September 26th in 1977. And they were, continued to live there up until the time that he was arrested. So, yes. So talking about his crimes, I'm going to go by the year because that's going to be the easiest thing when describing all of the attacks and the murders. Because again, let me remind you, he attacked 23 and murdered 13.
Oh my
so
gosh.
there's a lot. So Peter Sutcliffe's first documented assault was of a female sex worker who he ran into after trying to track down the sex worker who allegedly stole from him.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So it was kind of like, well, I can't find her, so next best thing,
You'll do.
Yeah. So the first few assaults that I'm going to talk about, I don't think that he was considered to do any of them. He confessed to these later. So, because I'll get into it. So, he was with a friend named Trevor Birdsall, I think. Sorry, Trevor. In Trevor's van. He got out of the van and walked up St. Paul's Road in Bradford until he was out of sight, he meaning Peter Sutcliffe. When he got back to the van, he was all out of breath and told his friend to drive off quickly. He said that he had followed a sex worker into a garage and hit her over the head with a stone and a sock. So he put a rock in a sock. Sorry, that rhymed. And in his words, he says, I got out of the car, went across the road and hit her. The force of the impact tore the toe off the sock and whatever was in it came out. I went back to the car and got in it. So,
oh my gosh.
So callous and so not detailed. Just, yeah, I got out of the car and I hit her. Just okay.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And
But
honestly, if I could do a Yorkshire accent, well, I would totally mock the fuck out of this dude, but I'm not going to because I don't want to offend the wonderful country of England with my shitty impressions. So,
right. But like, you hit her so hard that the rock basically flew out of the toe of your sock?
Yeah.
Jeez.
So, according to this, the police visited his home the next day. And again, this was in 1969. Did I mention that? This is in 1969. The police visited Peter's home the next day because the woman who was attacked had remembered Trevor's license plate. So Peter admitted to hitting this woman, but said it was with his hand. And this didn't go anywhere because the woman didn't want to
press any charges.
She didn't want to press any charges. She was just like, no, I just want to be over with this. She was a known sex worker, and I guess like her husband was like in jail for assault or something of that nature. So she was just like, I don't want any part of this. Never mind. Which is unfortunate. But I mean, here's the thing, it's sad, but if I were in her position, I don't know if I would want to either. It's a whole thing. So now we're going forward to 1975.
Oh, so, that's a jump.
Yeah, a little bit of a jump. I think this was all brewing time.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, so his second assault was on the night of July 5th in Keighley. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm sorry. A woman by the name of Anna, I'm going to butcher this last name, Rogolskij, I think. I'm really sorry. Was walking alone, and Peter struck her unconscious with a ball peen hammer and slashed her stomach with a knife.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So he got spooked by a neighbor and left after that. But I fully believe that he intended on killing her, but obviously doing it in public places like the moron that he is, he was interrupted. And that happens quite often with Peter Sutcliffe, the twat. Anna did survive, but she did have to have neurological surgery at Leeds General Infirmary. and
bet.
was absolutely traumatized, as you would
I
expect.
bet. Yeah.
She was afraid to go out. She felt like people were like looking at her and like pointing at her all the time. And she was quoted later saying, "The whole thing is making my life a misery. I sometimes wish I had died in the attack," which is very depressing. I am so sorry,
Yeah.
Anna. So, moving forward to August 15th, Peter attacked a woman by the name of Olive Smelt in Halifax. In Halifax? Sorry, England. Like he had with Anna, he very briefly engaged in like some pleasantries, like talk about the weather, and then struck the back of her head with a hammer. He slashed her lower
Wow.
back with a knife, but thankfully again was interrupted and left Olive badly injured. So like Anna, Olive was also very traumatized. She
Gosh.
told the officer who interviewed her, Dick Holland, who later became the Ripper's second in command, that the man who attacked her had a Yorkshire accent, but that important piece of info was ignored. So, August 27th, Peter Sutcliffe attacked a 14-year-old Tracy Brown in Silsden. He struck her from behind and hit her on the head 5 times while she was walking along a country lane. He ran off when he saw the lights of a passing car, and Tracy did need to get brain surgery.
Oh my gosh.
So
At
he's
14.
so
You're still
he's
very much developing at 14 and you do this to her. That
yep.
poor little thing.
So according to him in later times of him being interviewed and things of that nature, he says he didn't know she wasn't a prostitute, and when he realized that she wasn't, he stopped. This is according to Peter, though. He's a moron, and I don't believe him. So this attack on Tracy, yes. So this attack on Tracy, he ended up not being convicted of again, but did later confess to this in like 92, I think it was. Tracy gave a very good description of her attacker, but the police didn't connect it with future murders because she wasn't a sex worker. It didn't fit the pattern, so it was disregarded.
Oh my gosh.
That was in August. So now we're going to talk about Wilma McCann, who was the first victim to be killed by Peter Sutcliffe on October 30th of 1975. Again, we're in the same year. She was 28 years old and she was from Scott Hall in Leeds. She was a sex worker at the time. She was found on Scott Hall Road near the red light area, which was 150 yards from the council house where she lived with her 4 children between the ages of 7 and 2. She was a single mother at this time. Also, from the United States, if you don't know what a council house is, it's kind of like government public housing, kind of.
Oh, okay.
That's kind of what it is, yeah. Because I wasn't quite sure what a council house was either, but that's it. That's essentially what it is over in England. So her children were still in bed when this happened. She had been struck twice on the back of the head with a hammer. She had a stab wound to the throat, 2 or 3 stab wounds below the right breast, and 9 stab wounds around her belly button.
Oh my gosh, that is way overkill. This
Oh yeah.
dude has
Oh yeah, for sure.
anger issues.
And we will be seeing this because a pattern does emerge quite quickly. So, Mike Green, who is a forensic pathologist and senior lecturer in forensic medicine at the University of Leeds, who we do hear from in the documentary series, and I really liked what he had to say as far as just like the information that he had. He didn't necessarily put forth a lot of like, this is my opinion about this. It was very much like, this is what the evidence is telling me. And I really liked hearing from him. And not to mention, he's a pathologist, so he has the science. So,
Science.
So, he said that whoever had stabbed her took the time to move the instrument around and then stand back and then stab her again. Like,
Wow.
he took the time to do the movements. So there were no fibers or trace evidence in Wilma's case.
Oh
So
my gosh.
unlike a lot of serial killers that have like where it's kind of it's more sexually motivated, Peter Sutcliffe does not sexually assault, which is, I don't know, to me it's kind of rare. But he never leaves traces of seminal fluid or anything of that nature behind. So the press were calling Wilma a, in quotes, good time girl.
Oh my.
Which you can read between the lines. So I saw an interview that was like, this was just shrug another murdered sex worker. One of the I misspelled so much shit. Typing quickly without autocorrect is awful. But I saw one reporter refer to it as like a fish and chips murder. Like you'd be reading about this murder in the paper while eating your fish and chips with your friends and then just turn the page kind of thing.
Oh.
Like there was really not a lot of sympathy, which is awful.
Yeah, considering she left 4 little kids.
Exactly. So an extensive inquiry involving 150 officers of the West Yorkshire Police and after around 11,000 interviews, they had nothing.
Holy crap.
So Wilma split with her husband at the end of 1974 and, of course, was really struggling to raise her kids and make money. So that's kind of what she had to resort to. She had a rough go, and it was really sad. But Richard McCann, which was Wilma's son, who was 5 when she was killed, I've seen a couple of different interviews with him, and each time it makes me want to cry because it's so sad. But I'm going to quote something from the docuseries. Again, I'm going to quote from this docuseries a few times because I like the information that it gave me. And of course, I went other places for information. Richard McCann, I'm going to quote several times. And before I read this quote that I'm getting ready to read, before he was saying that, he was saying about how he was like, we had these police come and they were giving us cups of cocoa and little biscuits. And he was like, and I thought, well, this is so nice compared to the way people normally treat us, because his mom's a sex worker and they live in a council house, so they get treated like shit.
My gosh.
I know. And when he was like, they were giving us cups of cocoa, and I thought this was so nice, I was like, stop. So, yeah, so he says, I can remember the officer sitting us down and just telling us that our mom had been taken to heaven and we weren't going to see her again.
Oh, no.
Yes.
Oh, my gosh.
Take a moment, take a breath and cry and hold your dog for a second. And now we're moving on to 1976. So Emily Jackson, age 42, was the next person to be killed by Peter Sutcliffe in January of 1976. Her body was found behind a bakery, and just like Wilma, her body was found near a red light area. Her legs were pointed to the road, so the first thing that you saw was Emily. And I didn't mention how Wilma was positioned. I don't know how she was positioned, but the positioning of every body does become more relevant because that's part of his pattern. Gotcha. So again, her legs were pointed to the road, so the first thing that you saw when you came up was Emily. So her family was in dire financial straits. So her husband kind of talked her into trying sex work and so suggested utilizing the van of their family roofing business to like do her business in.
Interesting.
So I'll go on a little bit later to explain why everybody was in such dire straits, because that does matter.
Okay.
So she was a mother of 3. Peter picked her up outside of the Gaiety pub on Roundhay Road, then drove about half a mile to some rundown buildings. He hit her on the head with a hammer and dragged her body into a yard that was like full of trash. He stabbed her. Yeah, he stabbed her in the neck, chest, and abdomen. Some of the stab wounds were cross-shaped and others were rounded. So they came to the conclusion that the instrument used was a Phillips screwdriver. Emily was stabbed a total, I've seen 2 different accounts, but she was stabbed over 50 times.
Holy shit, man.
Yeah, so again, the exact number, I've seen 52, I've seen 56, but she was stabbed over 50 times.
This man is literal trash.
Yes.
He's, wow.
I'm not even done with Emily yet. So
Oh my gosh.
he stomped on her thigh so hard that he left an impression of his boot on her leg. So they determined that the shoe was a size 7, which is typically small for a man, so they considered it to be a good clue. Also, this showed the mental state of the assailant, thinking that even though he had killed her, he still had to show and continue to show his disgust for these women. So this was just another... It wasn't even a nail in the coffin. It was a staple in the coffin. Not needed, but it's there. Yeah. Does that make any sense? I don't know. Sorry.
It does.
Yeah, so they interviewed Emily's son, Neil Jackson, in the docuseries. Apparently he was 17 at the time. He was interviewed in the docuseries. He didn't know that his mom was a sex worker or doing sex work until the police came to the door to tell him that his mother had been killed. And he had to identify her body.
Oh, wow.
So the injuries to the back of Emily's head, the 2 obvious circular depressed fractures, from a forensic pathology view, this was the first like similarity between Emily and Wilma. So right away, we start seeing similarities. There's obvious blows to the back of both heads. He attacks them from behind. There's usually
like a fucking dick.
There's usually stabbing and slashing also involved. Now we have a pattern. So before the 70s, England was kind of booming economically. There's a lot of wealth around. Yorkshire especially. They built trains, textiles, a lot of factories. I think they said Bradford was like the number 1 textile manufacturer like in the world at the time.
Wow.
But by the 70s, though, a decline was definitely starting. Heavy engineering started falling apart because of foreign imports, and textiles were falling apart because of foreign exports. So the factories were fastly dying. The people with money were moving out of the area. It was a post-industrial age of suffering, basically, is the term that they used. Unemployment rates soared, and it was very bleak for a lot of people, which is why most of the sex workers around this area at the time were just women who had fallen on hard times and needed to sacrifice to be able to not only stay alive, but also feed their children.
Yeah.
And just try to survive, because this was life now, and they needed to do what they needed to do. Right. Along comes Peter Sutcliffe, the twat. So now we're moving on to 1977. On February 5th, Peter Sutcliffe attacked a woman named Irene Richardson, who was a sex worker at the time in Roundhay Park. She was killed, and her body was found by a dog walker. She was partially laying face down with her feet pointing toward the road. Her boots were laid neatly on top of the back of her legs, and her purse was by her side with its contents like meticulously laid out next to it, like someone took the time and took everything out of her purse and laid it out next to it. So this is when we really start seeing the displayed corpses in their possessions and stuff. So Irene was bludgeoned to death with a hammer, and once she was dead, Peter mutilated her corpse with a knife. So there were tire tracks left near the murder scene, which ended in a very long list of possible suspect vehicles. Which, I mean, what can you do? Like, take a picture, take a cast, and then try and track down this vehicle without raising suspicion to the murderer.
Right.
Because, I
Well,
mean, if that's the case, then they would just change their tires.
yeah,
And
but
not
I
to mention,
mean,
you have thousands of people with that possible tire.
right. And
So,
not everybody was like stupid William Suff and had 4 different tires on his van.
yeah, God, he's a moron.
Yeah.
So now, again, now they have a pattern. It's blow, death, mutilation. No evidence of penetrative sex, no evidence of seminal fluid, and the body is displayed afterwards. There's
Mm.
no doubt now they're looking for a serial killer. The police, however, were in a jumbled mess, to be frank. So, 2 of the men working on the inquiries that were main players, one was promoted, one was moved. People didn't know one day from the next who was in charge, who was their superiors. It was a nightmare.
Hmm.
Okay, so Jim Hobson, who was the lead investigator at this time, I'm going to read a quote from an interview that I saw of him. And this kind of goes to, it shows you that they were, with Irene, I think that they were just now starting to take it a little bit more seriously, but because these women were sex workers, they were still like, huh, just another sex worker killed, no biggie.
The
Um,
the thing is, if you're gonna think that way, maybe you might, it, find
again,
it in a
this is
different way. But this is anger. This is overkill. This is way overkill. So
exactly. So, but
that's
this is what I mean.
different.
This is what I mean by blatant sexism in this investigation.
Gosh.
Yeah. So I'm going to read a quote from him. This woman was living fairly respectable up to about 10 days before she met her death. She then seems to have gone down in status and has been wandering about the streets. And she could well have gotten into, or excuse me, she could well have got into a person's car and may have well been acting as a prostitute. And sorry for anyone that is offended by the word prostitute. I am going to use it a few times if I'm quoting someone. So,
Wow.
yeah. This is what I'm talking about. Like,
Gosh.
yeah. So Yorkshire had a police force, but then the smaller towns within them had their own police forces in the smaller towns. So the docuseries actually shows like a little diagram of the towns and like, okay, well, we have these big parts of a county and then all the little cities within them, they have their own police forces. So you have like the county police
Sure.
forces and then you have all the tiny city police forces. Now, that being said, by 1974, they had all became amalgamated with the city of West Yorkshire. So then they became the West Yorkshire Police Force. So now the close relationships that the small police forces had with the communities that they served, the knowledge they had of knowing like criminals, the different
Mhm.
sex workers, and informants that they got info from, and a great deal of that knowledge was lost within the unity of all these police forces. So instead of having all these different forces, they had one big giant police force, which is
Mm.
fine, but you know, for the first time ever in this newly constructed giant police force, they have a serial killer on their hands. Like in a
Yeah.
very newly constructed police force. Um, so they decided to go further with the tire mark and write down license plates and registrations of people that may have been in the area at the time. But of course, that ended up being like thousands of people. I saw an interview with
Oh,
one
I'm
of the,
sure.
yeah, I saw an interview with one of the police officers that was like, sometimes we would just have one guy standing to the side, another guy just reading out license plates as cars drove down the road, and we would write them down. I was like, that's what?
That is the
Yeah.
most pointless thing.
Yeah. So now, after the murder of Irene Richardson, they started comparing the brutality of Peter Sutcliffe's murders with Jack the Ripper. Another
Mm.
week I'm talking about Jack the Ripper, and I'm not even actually talking about Jack the Ripper. So they kind of coined the term the Ripper because people were kind of oddly like romanticizing the idea of like maybe it's Jack the Ripper reincarnated. People are dumb. But
Jeez.
so they started coining his murders as they came up with the name the Ripper because these were kind of like the Jack the Ripper cases. Like they were typically
Yeah.
sex workers. They were done in a very brutal nature and in public. So, a couple months after he killed Irene, he killed a woman named Patricia or Tina Atkinson. She was 32 years old and she was a sex worker from Bradford in her apartment. So, not a
Wow.
public place, in her apartment. So, these apartments were very, very run down. It wasn't a great area, but this was the first victim that was killed in her own apartment. Again, not in a
Yeah.
public place, in her apartment. So she was last seen leaving a hotel in the Bradford area. So basically, it was like she brought a client home, essentially. So the police found bloody footprints and boot prints on the sheets and the floor of her apartment. So they determined by the footprints that whoever had done this, whoever had killed her, then walked to the door to get a layout of the room, and then walked back to reposition her body.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So again, we have a pattern and it's continuing.
This
So,
guy.
yes. So the footprints matched the footprint left on Emily Jackson's leg. So this little fact doubled their resources because a person who murders a sex worker is most likely a stranger to them who doesn't know the person, which makes solving the murder that much harder,
Oh yeah.
unfortunately. So, unfortunately, looking into this boot print more would have been a literal search for a needle in a haystack because
Yeah.
there were so many of this kind of boot, they decided not to waste police resources on it and made the decision not to look into it. Yeah, which if I were on that side, I don't know how I would feel about that either. But I mean, look
Yeah.
at Richard Ramirez and his Asics shoes. I don't know.
Yeah.
So this was when they made the statement that if you were a quote unquote good girl who didn't have a lot of boyfriends or weren't a sex worker, that you were fine.
Oh,
Uh huh.
there are
Uh huh.
so many better ways to say that.
This is what I'm talking about. So now, a couple months later, after Tina's murder, Peter murdered a teenage girl by the name of Jayne McDonald in Chapeltown. Jayne lived at a home with her parents and worked in a supermarket. She was walking home alone late at night, so the police thought that maybe the murderer thought that she was a sex worker. She was found in a playground off Reginald Street. They came to the conclusion that she hadn't been killed there. They found marks in the grass where the murderer drug her body into the playground. And you see videos of like they just had like a straight line of police going through like blade of grass by blade of grass looking for different clues and things of that nature. It's wild. Sorry, I just hit
Wow.
my laptop. So Jayne was not a sex worker. She was 16. Which in the public's perception, this murder showed that no women were safe.
No.
Everyone was a potential victim. And now police realized that it wasn't just one certain type of woman, it was any woman. They had been so focused on the fact that he was murdering sex workers that any and all info they got regarding assaults to people who weren't sex workers, that they dismissed them. And now they have this murdered teenager case just staring them in the face now. And they realize,
Mhm.
oh shit, we've had blinders on the entire time.
Yeah.
So this is kind of when the investigation started turning a little bit. because now we have victim number 4 that's been murdered.
Mhm.
So I told you about before we started recording, there was an interview with her parents, and her dad was just a mess, and it was just absolutely heartbreaking. In the press, though, the police were describing her as a quote unquote, the first quote unquote innocent victim
Oh, wow.
because she wasn't a
Wow.
sex worker. So therefore, she was innocent.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. Wow. I just can't stop saying wow.
I know. And you're going to continue to get pissed off. I'm just telling you. So,
Wow.
yep. I'm telling this case is wild. It's absolutely wild. And like I said, Yorkshire police, they got some hate. And there were some things I published in like 2005. You know what? I'm getting ahead of myself. They got a lot of hate, and quite frankly, it was well deserved. So now people were falling over themselves to give the police any information at all.
Mm-hmm.
It turned into a local hunt for a as they termed, prostitute killer. And now it's a massive story because he murdered a teenage girl.
Mm-hmm.
So, because of public outcry after Jayne's murder, the case took a major turn.
Mm-hmm.
George
George.
Oldfield, who was the head of West Yorkshire CID, was basically parachuted into the city and appointed as the senior investigating officer. And he brought in a new team. And this was very criticized by other officers who were working on the case because, like I said, of the unity of all these police forces, you had the county men who worked for the bigger Yorkshire police forces, and then you had the city men who worked for the smaller towns. And so he was like, oh, he's a countryman coming in to do the city man's job, blah, 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 blah. It is what it is. So I also saw a video of a reporter that was talking about how everyone was feeling about the situation, and he's looking right at the camera and he goes, local feeling isn't hard to gauge. And then he turns slightly and the camera pans over to this wall, and he turns and looks at it, and it just says, Scott Hall says hang the Ripper, and has a little noose, and it's in big graffiti. And the way that the reporter just turned and he was like, local feeling isn't hard to gauge, and then just turned and like looked at this like big thing of graffiti. It was actually kind of funny. But after Jayne's murder, this affected everyone who lived in the area. Everyone was living in fear. It was all anyone could talk about, and everyone kept asking themselves, like, why hasn't he been caught? We're now on murder number 4 of this very violent offender, and he's still just in the wind. But the most unfortunate thing is that they were no closer to solving this than the day that they found Wilma McCann. So, I'm gonna quote the docuseries again. There was George Oldfield was interviewed, and the interviewer said, "Do you think the Ripper will strike again?" And Oldfield said, "I think there's every possibility that he will. The big question is when and where. My fear every Sunday morning when the telephone rings is, are we in business again?"
Interesting.
So, yeah. So the police were unbelievably desperate at this point, so they decided to print a letter in the Yorkshire Evening Post to the Ripper. And they literally titled it Message to the Ripper. So I couldn't find this whole article.
Damn it.
They read little inserts from it in the docuseries. I don't think it's the whole thing, but I do have a woman reporter in the docuseries reads it, and I'm going to go ahead and read everything that she read out because it's wow. So it says, in less than 2 years, you have butchered 5 women in Leeds and Bradford. I'm sorry, we're up to 5 murders, not 4. I can't count. Okay. So it says, message to the Ripper. In less than 2 years, you have butchered 5 women in Leeds and Bradford. Your motive, it is believed, is a dreadful hate for prostitutes. A hate that drives you to slash and bludgeon your victims. But inevitably, that twisted passion went terribly wrong on Sunday. An innocent 16-year-old lass, a happy, respectable, working-class girl from a decent Leeds family crossed your path. How did you feel yesterday when you learned that your blood-stained crusade against streetwalkers had gone so horribly wrong? That your vengeful knife had found so innocent a target? Sick in mind though you undoubtedly are, there must have been some spark of remorse as you rid yourself of Jayne's bloodstains.
I don't think I like that.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that either.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
Because first of all,
It was graphic. It was very graphic.
yes, but I don't like that it was the police that did that.
Yeah.
If it was a bystander or citizen, just regular Joe Blow that wrote that, that's one thing. But with the police doing that, that's not the way to go.
No.
That's not the way to go.
No. And as Jayne's, one of her parents, I couldn't imagine reading that. I wouldn't be happy about that. No, and it's
not just because of that. It's just you're the police, and you're thinking that this man is going to show some remorse about killing a teenager after the horrible things that he did to the other women. No, he's not going to show any remorse. No, he's not. So that was a pointless article that's just going to, first of all, for the family of the other women, they're going to be pissed and sad and all of the above. And then that poor little 16-year-old, I couldn't even imagine how they feel about that.
Oh, yeah. It's ridiculous. But going on, he assaulted a woman in July named Maureen Long in Bradford. She was leaving a dance.
So there's your answer, cops. No, he does not feel remorseful.
He didn't give a fuck. Yeah, no, that's the thing. And it's not even, at this point, I think it was just women in general.
Yeah.
That he had such a hatred for.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, he assaulted a woman in July named Maureen Long. She was leaving a dance club in Bradford and was picked up in a car and taken to a kind of wasteland-looking place just off Leeds Road. I saw a picture of it. It looks like a wasteland. I hope there's stuff there now, but at the time, it was a wasteland. So she had been struck in the back of the head and had been stabbed 4 or 5 times. He was interrupted and left her for dead.
Wow.
Yes. So when she was found, she was hypothermic and ended up spending 9 weeks in the hospital. Wow. But this was the first known Ripper victim, in quotes, to have survived. So this was a huge possible breakthrough. Police were like, finally something, because this is the 70s. As far as trace evidence and anything of that nature, like, there's no such thing as DNA yet. They had nothing. They literally had no evidence.
They could look for fingerprints. That's about it.
And there wasn't. That's the thing. So she spoke to the police from her hospital bed and they tried everything. They tried to get everything that they possibly could from her. But unfortunately, the damage from her injuries wiped her memory of the incident. And all she remembers is getting her coat and leaving the club.
Oh, no.
Again, in the docuseries. They interviewed a man named Andy Laptew, and he was a member of the Yorkshire Police at the time. And he was given the task to take Maureen Long back to the club and pose as a couple, and she would try and see if she saw anyone familiar. So I don't know exactly when this was done in regards to when she woke up from her injuries. I don't know if they interviewed her. I'm sure they interviewed her first, and then they were like, okay, well, let's try something else. Let's try and get anything to maybe jog your memory. Anyone that looks familiar, something. But of course, they had no luck. He didn't show. She didn't recognize anyone.
Right.
So apparently, this wasn't discussed in the docuseries, but I read that there was a witness to this assault, but they apparently like misidentified Peter's car, and they tried checking into this lead, and of course it led nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
So another thing that I want to talk about is, we're going back to the police. So there was something called the big wheel in the, I think they called it like the incident room at the like police station, whatever. So basically what it was is they would have people like on the phones all times during the day taking calls, because of course now that a teenager has been murdered, you have like over 100 people calling today saying, I think my brother Dave might be the Ripper, that sort of
Right.
thing. So I keep hitting my laptop. So they have all this information coming in, and because they have no leads, they have nothing, they look into every little possible thing that they can, because they just have no information. Yeah, so they have this big circular, I don't want to say file cabinet, but it's this big cabinet looking thing, and it's a wheel, and they had alphabetical order. If you got a call, you wrote something down, they give you a name, whatever, you go to the wheel, you find the person's name, and if there's no name, then you add that card to the wheel, and if their name is already in it, then you pull it out and you add the action or the call to their card. Is how they would do it. Yeah. But that's a fucking mess.
I mean,
and there were piles of paperwork everywhere in the department. So it was crazy, and they would get like they call them like actions. Like if you got an action, then you would go out and you would investigate the lead, that sort of thing. And they were getting like over 100 a day. So
gosh.
Yeah, it was nuts. So October 1st, Peter Sutcliffe murdered a woman named Jean Jordan, who was a known sex worker from Manchester, who was last seen in the red light area. So there is distance between Manchester and now these other murders, because the first person that they found to be like, oh, this is really weird, she's farther away than the other murders, was Patricia or Tina Atkinson. She was a little farther away, and that scared people, but now we're all the way over in Manchester, which is much farther away. So everyone's freaking out.
Is it still 1977?
Uh-huh. Okay. 77 was a busy year for Peter Sutcliffe.
Apparently it was.
Yes. So the fact that her body was found in Manchester was alarming, because it was much further away than the other cases. Because before this time, killers of this nature would typically stay in one area.
Mm-hmm.
But motorways started becoming much more of a thing and much more popular. And again, need to remind you, he was a lorry driver. So Peter got around.
So he could get around easily.
Yeah. And I mean, most of the time he would take people in his personal car. So it was probably, he was already someplace and then thought, I'm going to go back to here or something of that nature. I don't know.
Yeah.
So she was a known sex worker from Manchester who was last seen in a red light area. Her body was in an area that was to be like a known place where sex workers would take their clientele in Manchester. Mm-hmm. So Peter hid her body under a hedge, like under a bush. Mm-hmm. In his confession, Peter claimed that he had realized that the brand new £5 note that he had given her was traceable. Because every £5 note has a number that traces back to the bank in which it was first circulated.
Interesting.
Yes. So, also, I didn't have the symbol for pound, so I literally wrote 5LB for pound. Because on this old laptop, I don't have like the money pound sign. So I was like, you know hilarious. What? I gotta do what you gotta do.
You could have just typed out POUND.
LB is much quicker. 5 pounds. It's fine.
Very incorrect.
I knew
At least
what it
you were the
was.
only one seeing this.
Exactly. So, anyway. So, after hosting a party at his house, he returned to where he left her body, which was behind Manchester's Southern Cemetery, to retrieve the £5 note. So I'm not sure exactly what day he went back to find her body, but he wasn't able to find it. Because remember, Jayne was murdered on October 1st. I'm not sure what day Peter went back to try and find the £5, but he wasn't able to find it. So he moved her body out from underneath the hedge, couldn't find the £5, and then mutilated her body because he's a twat and was upset that he couldn't find it.
Oh my gosh.
So her body wasn't found until October 9th by he was like a baker at the time. His name's Bruce Jones. Apparently he's an actor now, I guess.
Oh.
So her body was naked and her clothes were scattered around her. So according to Bruce, he said that her hair was burnt. She was basically like gutted, like it was a rough scene.
Wow.
And I mean, of course, her body had been out there for 9 days already.
So that doesn't help things.
Yeah, after the initial damage, Peter went back a second time because he's a moron, but her body was naked and her clothes were scattered around her. There were slashes on her abdomen that showed that they were inflicted much later after death, and it was obvious that he was looking for something and lashed out when he couldn't find it. So Jordan's purse was found
like a child.
Like a child. So Jordan's purse was found a little ways from her body, and its contents were thrown about all over the place. Like clearly someone was looking for something and wasn't taking the time that he normally does. So it was obvious that he made a mistake somehow.
Mm-hmm.
The £5 note was hidden in a secret compartment in Jordan's purse. So it had came into circulation only 4 days before her death, because the circulation of money actually isn't as long as you would think. And the police managed to trace it back to one of 3 banks in Shipley, Bradford, and Bingley. This was the best lead that they had gotten thus far. So from there, they were able to narrow this down to 8,000 possible employees who could have received this £5.
Wow.
Yeah, and then over the next 3 months, the police interviewed around 5,000 men, which included Peter Sutcliffe.
Oh.
But the police found that the alibi that he had given them was credible, and that he had spent the evening at a party, which is what he did. So after weeks of investigating the origins of the £5 note, it led nowhere, and they were unable to find the employee within the bank or the man it was given to.
Mm.
So back to incompetence. This would be the first of 9 interviews that the police did with Peter Sutcliffe before he was caught. And he wasn't even caught because of an interview that they were doing for a murder. It was like expired tags or something like that. Something really dumb.
A stupid traffic violation.
Yes, and we'll get to it.
And how many serial killers or just killers in general were caught because of a stupid ass traffic violation?
Bill Suff.
Yeah.
Yep.
Ted Bundy.
Yeah. Again,
I mean,
we will get to it. So again, the first of 9 interviews. He was interviewed 9 different times by the police throughout this entire investigation. And it lasted from 75 until 81.
Oh my gosh.
I have to look at my notes. Mm-hmm.
They've had him so many different times. And again, the balls on the dude. Like, the police have already interviewed you once, and you're going to go back out and kill and attack somebody else. Well, they're going to interview you again and be like, you're not catching me. And you're going to go out and do it again. Wow.
I know. So on December 14th, he attacked a woman named Marilyn Moore, who was a sex worker from Leeds. She survived and was able to give the police a description of her attacker.
Good on you, Marilyn, man.
So unlike Maureen, she was able to remember her attacker. She gave a good description of him and also gave a good description of his car, which had been seen frequently in red light districts.
Mm.
Which, if you look at the sketch, because there's going to be a couple in this case, looking at the sketch, it kind of looks like a young Sylvester Stallone, but it's Peter Sutcliffe. Like, it's very clearly him. He has one haircut and a style of beard and mustache it's him. I don't know how many people looked like him in this investigation, but it's him. And remember Tracy Brown, an early assault victim, also gave a good description of her attacker. Said he had a Yorkshire accent and was ignored because this was before any murders. So there was also tire tracks found at this scene, which matched the tire tracks found at Irene Richardson's crime scene. They again interviewed Peter regarding Marilyn.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. And that is where I will be ending part 1. Part 2, we're going to start in 1978.
Okay.
It's a lot. And
yeah. Well, yeah.
Peter Sutcliffe's case is so big that I wanted to not only try and find any information about these women's personal lives and the family that they left behind, and I wanted to make sure that I really got into the police side of the investigation, and I want to talk about his death for a minute too. So this is going to be a 2-parter for show. Otherwise, it's going to be really long, and I'm not Paige, so I'm going to spread my stuff out.
I didn't realize that Lisa Montgomery would take that long.
Seriously, now I edited it down. I edited it down, but it was the recording itself was 2.5 hours. So I was like, I hate her. And because
can't help it. I can't help it.
And you know, anyone who's just listening may not realize, but Paige talks like William Shatner and leaves long pauses between her phrases.
Hey, when you go to edit this one, you're going to find that you're doing it too really bad.
It's been a long day. I've been doing nothing but researching. And my mouth's real dry. But again, that's where I'm going to leave the end of part 1. And I think I'm going to fit everything into the second part because I don't want to drag it out for a third. We'll leave that for our even bigger cases.
Yeah.
But you can follow us on Facebook at
2KOA.
And you can follow us on Instagram at 2KOA Podcast. And we do have a Gmail. It's 2KOApodcast@gmail.com. And again, every time that you write the name 2KOA, it is with the number 2. And we also do have a YouTube channel where you can see pretty pig faces at 2KOA Podcast. So we hope you keep listening, and we will see you next week for Peter Sutcliffe Part 2.
Part 2. Bye.
Bye.